This is Noise from the Cranium. My name is Doug, and in this episode I'm going to delve into the history of drum solos in rock music. I had this idea when my wife and I were talking about musical trends. It got me to thinking about certain elements within music that start off as innovation and end up being so widely used that they eventually become the dreaded cliché of a particular musical era. Success breeds copycats, which leads to overexposure, then contempt, and finally outright hatred. This process can take years. There have been many musical trends that have come and gone, but one of my favorites started in 1960s rock music, when extended drum fills and longer solos began to appear. Jazz has historically featured drum solos since the Roaring '20s, but the first drum solo in rock appeared in 1958. The first few were novelty songs that found success on the music charts. The first extended drum fill I remember hearing was on a surf rock instrumental by the Surfaris called Wipeout. The song was released in 1963, right in the middle of the surf music boom. It made it to number 2 on the Billboard charts and featured a 17-year-old Ron Wilson wailing away on the drums. Wipeout became one of the best-known instrumentals from the era. In 1965, The Who recorded the song My Generation, which ended up being their most successful single and one of their best-loved and iconic songs. Drummer Keith Moon, who coincidentally was a surf music aficionado, put together a wild ending to the song featuring a manic drum frenzy. In an interesting twist, Moon, who would go on to become one of the greatest drummers in rock, refused to do drum solos live as he thought they were boring. However, when you listen to his recorded work, in some cases the entire song sounded like a drum solo. During the evolution of rock music in the 60s, jazz and blues influences began to appear, bringing along a higher degree of musicality and skill. In 1966, Ginger Baker of Cream and Mitch Mitchell of the Jimi Hendrix Experience brought their jazz chops to their respective bands, helping to create a new sound as psychedelic music exploded out of England. Baker had honed his chops in a number of blues and R&B bands, and by the time he formed Cream with Eric Clapton and Jack Bruce, he was considered one of the best drummers in England. Their first album included a song written by Baker called Toad, which consisted of a guitar intro followed by an extended drum solo. This solo was one of, if not the first, extended drum solos in a rock song, and paved the way for complex drum solos in rock music. This was the solo that set the bar. Jimi Hendrix had been a struggling musician in the US for a number of years when in September of 1966 he gave up on the US music scene and moved to England. He quickly put a band together. While auditioning for drummers, Hendrix found 2 drummers that would fit the bill. He couldn't decide between the 2, so after tossing a coin, Mitch Mitchell became the drummer of the newly christened Jimi Hendrix Experience. Take a listen to Mitchell's jazzy drum work while Hendrix sings the song.
Listen here, baby. Stop acting so crazy. You say your mom ain't home and ain't my concern. Just to play with me and you won't get burned. I've only one itch and desire. Let me stand next to your fire.
In 1968, Iron Butterfly put out an album and song called In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida. The song took up one entire side of their album. It was edited down to under 3 minutes for the radio and became a hit, making it to number 30 on the Billboard charts. Originally titled In the Garden of Eden, the song was written one night while the singer Doug Ingle was drunk. He played the song for drummer Ron Bushy and asked him to write down the lyrics. By that point, Ingle was slurring his words, so what Bushy wrote down came out as In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida. Later, they decided that the slurred lyric was pretty catchy, so they kept it. The version that ended up being released on the album resulted from an extended studio rehearsal that was recorded while they were waiting for the producer to arrive, and included a drum solo by Ron Bushy. When they listened back, it turned out to be a good enough take to go on the record. By 1969, the drum solo became so trendy even the Beatles did it. While recording the medley on side 2 of Abbey Road, John, Paul and George did guitar solos on The End, trading off 2 bars at a time. McCartney then suggested to Ringo that he should do a drum solo. Ringo, like Keith Moon, hated drum solos and would never do them, either live or on record. He was finally coerced into doing a short solo, but was stumped as to what to play. He ended up actually copying part of it from Ron Bushy's solo from In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida. When Led Zeppelin burst onto the scene in 1969, they possessed one of the heaviest drummers of all time. John Bonham's style of playing revolutionized hard rock and heavy metal drumming. His drum showcase was Moby Dick, which appeared on their second album. Like Cream's Toad, the song consisted of a guitar-based intro followed by an extended drum solo, which incorporated Bonham's novel idea of playing the drums with his hands. Over the next 10 or 15 years, short drum solos began showing up everywhere. You could easily find an interesting drum solo on songs that were played on AM radio, while you'd have to switch to FM to hear the longer album tracks. Some of my favorites were Born to Be Wild by Steppenwolf, Won't Get Fooled Again by The Who, Frankenstein by the Edgar Winter Group, Radar Love by Golden Earring, and Tom Sawyer by Rush. They all had pretty cool drum fills. Some of the deeper album cuts that grabbed my attention were Highway Star by Deep Purple, Carnival 9 by Emerson, Lake and Palmer,
Soon the gypsy queen in a glaze of Vaseline will perform on guillotine. What a scene, what a scene. Next
and Time by Pink Floyd. Even Karen Carpenter got into the action, doing a drum solo on a Carpenter's TV special in 1976. There were some great drum solos on the live albums that proliferated the 1970s. A couple of my favorites were Los Endos by Genesis, which featured a drum duet by Phil Collins and Chester Thompson. And one of my favorites, The Professor, Neil Peart, doing a drum solo on Rush's live album All the World's a Stage.
Ladies and gentlemen, The Professor on the drum kit.
Many of my favorite bands have great drummers who have had remarkable drum performances over the years. From Ian Pace in Deep Purple, Carl Palmer from Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Bill Bruford in Yes and King Crimson, the many great drummers that were in Zappa's bands over the years, Neil Peart from Rush, and Phil Collins in Genesis. It is sadly ironic that although Collins' best drum work can be found on early Genesis material and his jazz fusion side project Brand X, he would gain more fame with his solo career, which was kicked off by his massive hit In the Air Tonight, featuring a drum break that literally redefined the way drums were recorded in the 1980s. suppose it is inevitable that innovative and interesting musical trends, at first highly anticipated, become banal and dreaded cliches. In the 1970s, most concertgoers looked forward to the drum solo. Case in point, here's a snippet of a live recording of Max Webster in concert in 1976, where an audience member wishes the drummer plays a solo.
Hope he doesn't drum solo.
Towards the end of the 1970s, drum solos had become commonplace and in some cases pointless, as nearly every drummer was expected to do a solo live, even the ones with little imagination or technical proficiency. Then, as punk rock morphed into the new wave of the 1980s, the drum solo virtually disappeared. Sure, there were bands with great drummers, like the Police with Stuart Copeland, but by and large the drum solo became the dreaded concert killer, kind of a forced intermission, giving the audience the cue to go to the bathroom or a refreshment stand. It didn't help that drum machines became the trend. Even when grunge brought back a rockier feel, they forgot to resurrect the drum solo. It remains all but non-existent today, except for a select few niche markets like the heavy metal arena rockers, prog rock survivors, and jazzers, who forge ahead oblivious to trend. I'm going to leave you with one of the tastiest jazz drum breaks in a pop song, performed by Steve Gadd as session drummer for Steely Dan. Their 1977 album Asia was steeped in jazz references, and the break in the song is divine. This has been Noise from the Cranium. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time.